I will go ahead and get started. I'm watching the number of attendees just keep climbing and climbing, and so I'm happy to welcome you all. Um, Greetings and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we celebrate the launch of Something in the Water, the 21st Century Civil Rights Odyssey, the new book from Michael W. Waters that is launching today. We are honored to be hosting this event tonight with Reverend Dr. Waters, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, and Dr. Leah Gunning Francis. I'm Brad Lyons. I'm the president and publisher at Chalice Press. In the past few years, Chalice Press has been recognized for our work on anti-racism resources. We're proud to publish books like Something in the Water that are helping us, both as individuals and as members of our diverse society, make a difference every day in the struggle for justice, equality, and reconciliation. When this summer's murder of George Floyd propelled millions of people out into the streets crying out for justice, begging America yet again to affirm that Black Lives Matter, readers who wanted to create change in themselves and their communities found Chalice Press books and put them to work. Our authors and our readers want to change the world, and we're grateful Chalice Press books are among the many ways we can all work together for that change. To set the stage for tonight's event, we want to share the beautiful, inspiring, brand new book trailer from Something in the Water.
400 years ago, there was something in the water. It was us, kidnapped from the mother continent. But you see, there was something else in the water, something toxic. There's something in the water that caused the lynching of black and brown bodies.
If you came tonight and you are in pain,
peer into the water.
All Japanese were required to move.
Shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Protesters at the Dakota Access Pipeline continue to be met with insane violence.
A militarized police force up against an unarmed, peaceful prayer force.
Looks like mass incarceration. Looks like children in cages. Peer into the water. Do you see it? It looks like toxic water in Flint. Looks like 9 black bodies bombarded by bullets in a Bible study.
These people were in church. They were in church.
It looks like Charlottesville. There's something in the water. Looks to me like Emmett Till. It sounds like Eric Garner.
don't let go of what you're feeling right now.
It sounds like hashtag, 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 hashtag. There's something in the water. Looks like Selma. Looks like Ferguson. So we resist.
Protests breaking out in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C.
We resist. And I ask you in the spirit of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the time is always right to do what is right, and now is the time to do what is right. We resist.
We still have to grapple with racial injustice and a reckoning on who we intend to be as a nation.
There's something in the water. There's power in the water. There's deliverance in the water. All of these issues are connected. The poverty of our city, the legacy of white supremacy. There's healing in the water. So let justice flow like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
So I'm glad you're still here. That trailer is going to be the kind of thing that can force people to run out and drop what they're doing and get involved this very minute. So maybe it wasn't the best idea to show it at the beginning. Maybe it's a good idea to show it at the end so we can all act on it. So now, without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our moderator. Tonight's conversation is led by Dr. Leah Gunning Francis, the Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Dean of the Faculty at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. Dr. Gunning Francis is also the author of Chalice Press's book, Ferguson and Faith, Sparking Leadership and Awakening Community. sharing what she learned from the leaders of the protests following the murder of Michael Brown. It is my honor to introduce my friend, Dr. Gunning Francis, who will in turn introduce her fellow panelists. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Brad, and good evening, everyone. It's a joy to be with you tonight as we celebrate the launch of the Reverend Dr. Michael Waters' latest book, Something in the Water. As many of you know, Dr. Waters is the founder and lead pastor of the Abundant Life AME Church in Dallas. He and his wife, Ulysses, are the proud parents of 4 children and are just really profound and engaged leaders in Texas as well as around the country. Dr. Waters has appeared in numerous magazines and has engaged in a lot of television interviews where he has consistently been a champion and drum major for justice and racial issues related to racial justice. His award-winning books, Stakes is High, Race, Faith, and Hope for America, won the National Wilbur Award in Nonfiction, and for Beautiful Black Boys Who Believe in a Better World, the winner of the National Goddard Riverside Children's Book from the Youth Council. And so it is our joy and honor to come tonight and celebrate Dr. Waters' latest book, Something in the Water. And we are super excited to be joined this evening by Mr. Beto O'Rourke. We know that Beto is a lifelong Texan, has committed his life to public service in so many ways, starting with the city council, going up to serve as the U.S. representative for Texas 16th Congressional District, and was a very vibrant and engaging presidential candidate in the 2020 election. He and his wife, Amy, have 3 children, and we know that they are also very dedicated public servants, champions for human rights, champions for justice, and we are delighted to have you with us this evening. Beto, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so very much. Honored to be with you and Beto tonight, and greetings to all who have joined us for this evening.
Leah, it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Well, let's jump right in. I wanted to read a passage from Michael's book because one of the ways that he has structured this book, it's a little bit different than some of the others, where he's really taking us on a journey that spans over a year or so, but also looks back onto history and gives us some insights as to things as we need to think about for working toward a future that's filled with hope and justice. And the way he does that is recounting some of the sermons and speeches that he has given over the years, and it shows off his artistic ability and even introducing poetry and lament and just all of the emotional expressions that are very much integral to this work for racial justice. Because when we talk about justice, this is not an abstract concept, but rather we are talking about flesh and blood, real people, human lives. And so the central claim of Michael's book is that there is just something in the water when we talk about the ongoing pervasiveness of racial injustice in these United States of America. And so I thought I'd kick us off this evening by starting with a lament that Michael had written titled Something in the Water. 400 years ago, there was something in the water. It was us, it was our ancestors, kidnapped from the mother continent, bound with chains, shoved deep in the hulls of ships named Jesus, Hope, and Desire. The first 20 ancestors landed in 1619, brought across these Atlantic waters, docked an hour northwest in Jamestown. There was something else in the water, our bodies, the bodies of our ancestors, tossed overboard into watery graves that muted their cries. Kidnappers could not collect on a sick body, but they could collect on lost cargo, so overboard we went. Ever since, there has been something in the water, something toxic concocted from the decay of the bodies callously thrown overboard. Let's call it hate. Let's call it denying the humanity of all God's creation. Let's call it forsaking the image of God present in every human countenance. Let's call it evil. This is something in the water has caused the theft of native lands. This something in the water has caused the lynching of Black and brown bodies. Peer into the water. Do you see it? Looks like mass incarceration, looks like children in cages, looks like Flint, looks like Standing Rock, looks like 9 bodies bombarded by bullets in Bible study, looks like 3 Black churches burned down in Louisiana, looks like redlining, looks like the Tuskegee experiment, looks like Charlottesville. There's something in the water, looks like Emmett Till, sounds like Eric Gardner, I Can't Breathe. Sounds like Michael Brown, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. Sounds like Tamir Rice, Botham Jean, Sandra Bland, Rekia Bourne, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Antoine Rose, Elijah McClain, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, Jacob Blake, hashtag, 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 hashtag. Sounds like the cries of a mother with 3 jobs who can't afford to feed her child. Sounds like self-hate. Sounds like pulling the trigger on another brother in the set. Nipsey, rest in peace. In lament, we hear the cry of the prophet Habakkuk, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. We hear Billie Holiday's cry, scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh, strange fruit. We hear Pac's cry, that's Tupac. I suffered through the years and shed so many tears. Lord, I lost so many peers and shed so many tears. We hear Marvin Gaye's cry, makes me wanna holler, throw up my hands, makes me wanna holler, throw up my hands. There's something in the water. Michael, tell us about this something that's
Wow, well, just hearing you recite those words was almost an out-of-body experience for me. And I'm grateful for your sharing. You know, as I journeyed over the last year, prior to COVID hitting, primarily in 2019 to the beginning of 2020, I was struck by the multiplicity of brutalities and horrors that have been visited upon these shores, that continue to be visited each and every day. I mean, if we really try to quantify the number of lives crushed to the earth because of the realities of white supremacy, I think we'd have some struggles doing that. Even that mentioning of those names, it pales in comparison to the amount of individuals who've actually suffered. I think one of the great pains, unfortunately, is that we don't know many of the names of our ancestors who were enslaved. We can't truly express the pain of their cries, the disappearance of their bodies, the women and men who were sexually assaulted over generations. And so, you know, this is very moving to hear you recite these words, but it demands something of us. It demands a righteous and active response. You know, white supremacy comes with a body count. And not only are we called to count and name the bodies, we are called to work to bring about justice.
Absolutely. Beto, you spent a good part of your life making the case that this demands a response. What say you these days in hearing this as we take a look back as it relates to racism, racial injustice, the treatment of Black bodies, the pilfering of native lands, and moving us forward to where we are in this present moment?
Leah, I just have to concur with Reverend Waters. Hearing you recite his words right now was incredibly moving to me. And I'm so grateful that this is being recorded. And I would love to watch and listen to the recording of your recitation again. And I want my kids to hear it. And I want other people that I know to hear it. His words are powerful. Your reading of them is so powerful. One of the things that really strikes me about Reverend Waters' leadership and the words in this new profoundly powerful book that I encourage everyone to pick up is there's this comfort that many of us have taken in this idea that progress is inexorable and inevitable and will happen of its own accord. There's really no participation necessary on our part to bring it about. And sometimes, and Reverend Waters points this out in this book, sometimes there are some who wittingly or unwittingly twist the meaning behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s words about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, as though it is just going to bend of its own accord and we can just sit back and wait for that to happen. And the message that I get loud and clear from this book is no, it won't. And in fact, it requires action from all of us. And again, he quotes the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King when he talks about justice never being freely given by the oppressors, and that it has to be demanded by the oppressed. And if there were any other necessary evidence or proof of that, we received it on Wednesday when you had more than 8,000 white supremacists carrying Confederate flags, wearing T-shirts that said Camp Auschwitz on them, talking about hanging the Speaker of the House, tying up a noose for the Vice President, and really grinding on this grievance that has been brought forward so fully by the president. And again, here's Reverend Waters reminding us in the book that this is not the doing of Donald Trump, but in fact, Donald Trump has touched something that is very much American. And so when current commentators, as recently as tonight, or politicians, or even our next president say, this is not America, let's be honest with one another and ourselves and admit that this is in fact America. And there's some agency in that realization and understanding and acceptance of the truth, and also our responsibility to change America for the better and for everyone. And so I got to tell you, Leah, in reading this book in this moment, which is such a incredibly dark moment, I left with more energy than when I entered. I'm inspired. I'm rededicated to the fight in front of me and in front of all of us. And so action is the word that I take from this. He's calling us to act and reminding us, and in fact, again, he does this in the book, that faith is dead without that action. And we are now called to account and called to act in this moment.
You know, Beto, that's a really important point, especially about the claims and the continued call that this is not who we are, when the facts just don't bear that truth out. And so the response, the active response to which we are all being called, is right before us and beckoning us to move forward. Michael, as you think about not only the journey that you have taken up until this point, and as we move forward toward these days of action and what that looks like for us as individuals, as everyday citizens, things that we can do going forward. I also want to make mention that you have a chapter in the book titled Dallas, America's Capital of Functional White Supremacy. And so I'm wondering if there are things that you have gleaned from your time there, from living there, from things that have happened that might also shed some light on what we need to take into our hearts and minds to help us see anew that, one, yes, this is who we are, and two, what are some of the things that we need to start doing about it if we this time are going to move toward a future filled with hope, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children.
You know, the story of Dallas is a story that is not well known even to a lot of persons who reside in the city. But during my time here, I have become well acquainted with not only the realities we currently face, but the horrors that put them to bear. At the beginning of the 20th century, the city of Dallas boasted the largest Ku Klux Klan chapter in America. As a matter of fact, at its height, 1 out of 3 eligible men in the city of Dallas were a part of the Klan. That included judges, that included police officers, that included many Dallas mayors, leaders of business and industry. And they created a city that really showed forth their desires, what was in their heart, the redlining that took place in the city, the bombing campaigns, the terror rides, the Black bodies abducted and taken down to the Trinity River, something in the water, that were beaten and brutalized, and even those bodies that were lynched along what we call the Trinity River. But it is a history not known by many persons within the city. And so I really felt compelled to bring forth this history to shine a lens, to shine a light on where we are today. The Urban Institute back in 2018 said that the city of Dallas was the most racially inequitable, racially segregated city in America, 274 out of 274 American cities. The dividing marker is Interstate I-30. If you live above I-30, you are in about 85 to 87% tax base. You live below I-30, you see the disparity there. Even though below I-30 is a land expanse greater than Denver and Seattle combined, greater than the city of Atlanta. So you have a vast desert of poverty, of food apartheid. And yet when people think about Dallas, they think about the Cowboys, they think about restaurants, they think about nightlife, they think about the show Dallas. And yet all of these people here in our city for many generations have been experiencing immeasurable harms. So I say that because I believe that Dallas is really a microcosm of America. As challenging as you think things are in America, it's much worse. When you look at the cost, when you look at the impacts of white supremacy, that today, right, in the city of Chicago, I had an interview with Chicago News earlier in the day, there is a 30-year disparity in terms of life expectancy amongst zip codes. Right here in Dallas, if you live in 75215, which is South Dallas, for every mile that you travel north, life expectancy increases for you by 5 years. Dallas has, or the Dallas County has, the most uninsured workforce in America, which has been particularly challenging during these days of COVID. In Dallas County, a Black person earns 54 cents to a white person's dollar, Latinx person earns 58 cents to a white person's dollar, and on and on and on. And through my experience here, what I've learned is that white supremacy doesn't fix itself. It doesn't change because you pray about it. It doesn't change because you march about it. You must organize and mobilize to bring forth the change that is needed. And I think I saw that with glaring clarity during the Confederate monument struggle here in our city, where there were so many persons for so many years were speaking so well about diversity and progress, but put all of the effort they could muster in protecting these icons of white supremacy, including the mayor at the time, who even suggested that we put forth a lynching monument at the foot of the Confederate monument, which I thought was an affront. I mean, a gross affront to the experiences of our people. What happened, what brought about that change was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious response in the streets, as well as in the city council chambers, the pressure to bring about the progress. And so I lean in Dallas because I think that Dallas, again, is a microcosm of America, that many times we're walking around having experiences, not knowing the history that gave shape to those experiences. So even with my own children, I'll say this very quickly, as young people, as we would drive across the city, they would ask questions. Why is it hard to find a restaurant on this side of town, but it's not on that side? Why does everything look different? I mean, the streets look manicured and the public spaces looked well kept, but over here it's a little bit different. And that then invited a conversation with those young people, with our children, about the impacts of redlining. There's so many people who have been impacted by redlining, and yet they've never heard of the policy. They never heard of the continuance of the harm that has been visited upon each generation. And so my hope in this chapter that goes all the way back to the Caddo Nation, the tribe that was massacred on the banks of the Trinity River, all the way forward to the Trinity River in some regard serving as that divider in our city, all the way forward still to the environmental racism in terms of the pollution of that river, and even Shingle Mountain in southern Dallas, which has been a great harm. I'm trying to make some connections here about what's happening in our city and actually what we need to do to bring about change.
And you know, these are the things that each of us can do in our own way. First of all, educating ourselves on the history of the spaces right where we live. As you said, there are people that live in Dallas that don't even know about that particular history, which isn't even that far away, that has shaped the current reality for thousands of people right there. Back in the day when we were still going around and speaking in different places and flying places, when I could, I would take my children with me when they were older. And one of the things we would always do is go and visit the African American Museum in whatever city we were in, because we need to make sure that we're helping to educate ourselves, educate our children and our young people to understand that what we are seeing today did not just emerge with the election of Donald Trump, but that this has been a long-standing march toward this moment. Beto, how about you? What are some of the things that you see that we can do either as parents, as citizens, that help to raise this type of awareness?
You know, I think about what Reverend Waters just said about Dallas, which in some form is true for much of the former Confederacy and certainly a lot of Texas. And I connect it to political power and the path to change the policies that would produce more equitable results for the people who live in Dallas or who live in this state. And it's really interesting, Leah, that despite the fact that Texas had, in absolute terms, its largest voter turnout in the history of the state in the 2020 election. And despite the fact that, you know, pick a policy issue. If it's healthcare, we're the least insured state in the country. If it's criminal justice, you know, a 5-year-old Black child is 5 times as likely as a 5-year-old white child in the kindergarten classroom to be suspended or expelled or disciplined and placed on that schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline. And that's right here in Texas. You look at immigration, you look at the kids in cages on the US-Mexico border, it all comes to a head here in Texas. And yet, despite all of that, we rank 46th in the country in voter turnout, very close to dead last. Now, it's not that we have a lack of love of democracy. It's not that we don't want to be civically engaged. It is the pernicious consequence of the institutional racism that has defined life in Texas for so many of our fellow Texans for so many generations. For example, from 1924 to 1944, for 20 years in the 20th century, including 4 years when Black men were dying on battlefields in Europe to defend democracy, they by law could not cast a ballot in the state of Texas, thanks to the all-white Democratic primary, which was finally broken, by the way, in large part, thanks to the leadership of a Black El Pasoan, Lawrence Nixon, who took his case to the Supreme Court not once, but twice, and through his persistence and patience over the course of 20 years, was able to integrate our voting. But really, it took another Texan, forced by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to bring America really into a democracy in 1965. And if you think about it, we've really only been a democracy for about 55 years so far, where everyone has, at least by law, the opportunity to participate. But practically speaking, and in function in Texas, that is not yet the case. We make it harder than any other state in the union to register, to vote, to participate, and to run for office. And so I got to tell you, as somebody in the political field, meeting Reverend Waters, listening to him speak, his ability to connect what for many might seem like ancient history to very present, urgent concerns and crises in our country and in our communities was transformational for me as a candidate for Senate in 2017 and 2018. And much of what you just heard him say, I literally had a dashboard view of as he drove me through some of these neighborhoods in Dallas and literally connected the dots for me so that I, as a candidate, could reflect that in the platform upon which I ran. And hopefully, should I be in a position of public trust, to act on that on behalf of those who deserved and demanded and were fighting for that justice. And so I really feel like it is my responsibility as someone who's still working in voter registration and organizing of voters in Texas to ensure that we stay focused on these changes that will not only improve conditions for those who are living in some of these neighborhoods that Reverend Waters has described, but achieve that justice that until we do makes any kind of peace or long-term holistic progress absolutely impossible. So I think beyond my eyes being open to a history that I did not understand and as a white man never lived, I think I also now understand what our charge is in terms of ensuring that our politics are harnessed to the justice that so many seek and will only allow us to realize our potential and promise as a country if we achieve that. So it's as somebody in politics, it's connected all these things for me in a way that I never understood before.
That's really powerful. And so as we think about politics in our current landscape, in just a little over a week, there will be a president, a Democratic president, a Democratic-controlled Congress, a Democratic-controlled Senate. There are quite a few hopes being hung on what might be possible going forward, because let's just start with voting. And we know the kinds of things that have been done to chip away at the Voting Rights Act that ensured that Black people would have fair and equitable access to the ballot box. And we have seen how those rights have been compromised over time, and we can just go on down the list. What are you seeing as priorities and urgent for the Biden administration to take on in the early days of their work? Now, let me first say, yes, I think we would all agree that COVID has to get under control. You know, we have a raging pandemic. The United States, ladies and gentlemen, is leading the world in COVID infections and deaths. So that absolutely has to get under control. But yet at the same time, there are other major issues, pandemic-like, if you will, that have to be addressed. What do you all see as some of the things that need to be on the table in the very early days of this administration?
Well, you know, Dr. King said in his, what we now call the I Have a Dream speech, that Black people in America would never truly be free, and I'm paraphrasing this, until we finally address the stain of police brutality. And so I am hopeful that the George Floyd Act might be passed to bring forth national police reform within our nation, something that we have needed for quite some time. I'm hopeful as well as we have the sainted memory of John Lewis, whose presence I had the honor of being in on several of occasions, was able to study the scar tissue on his head, left when a crate crashed down upon that beautiful head in 1961 during the Freedom Rides. We need to shore up our Voting Rights Act, and we need to pass the John Lewis Act for voting. But I want to press even further still. There is a Congresswoman from Houston, Sheila Jackson Lee, who has put before the Congress H.R. 40, which really is a reference to 40 acres and a mule. And this is where it gets real touchy in America, is anytime you start adding a price to justice. But Dr. King did it. W.E.B. Du Bois did it. Frederick Douglass did it. They talked about the investments that are necessary to address the inequities that have been experienced by our people. It is time to seriously have conversations about reparations. Dr. King called for it in 1964 in his book, Why We Can't Wait, when he called for a bill for the disenfranchised. He spoke of it again in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, chaos or community when he said that we have to have the immediate abolition of poverty. We live in a time where even before COVID, we had the greatest wealth disparity in American history. Economists suggest to us that it would take 228 years for the median wealth of a Black family to equate to that of a white family. 2 centuries, 25 years, and 3 years on top of that to bring us to equity. There are fewer Black homeowners today in America than there were in 1968. And we know the practices of redlining in Dallas and across the country continue. It's very interesting. Dr. King didn't go in 1963 initially to talk about his dream. That was his hoop. That was his conclusion. That was Mahalia Jackson yelling out as he spoke, Dr. King, tell him about your dream. Dr. King went and talked about a check that has been returned with insufficient funds, that there needs to be a radical investment. And not only did Dr. King talk about that, but even the Kerner Commission that was put forth by Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1967, even they stated that unless we had a true investment to bring about equity and equality, we would continue to move in this divergent stream of 2 societies. And so it's very, very important that we have serious conversations of what this investment looks like. It has been suggested that when you look in terms of unpaid wages to persons who were enslaved in our nation between 1619 and 1865, that America owes $97 trillion, a debt of $97 trillion, built upon the Blacks of those who were enslaved, would ultimately allow this nation to create the strongest economy in the world. And there are still corporations to this day, institutions and schools that benefit from that unpaid labor. And so, yes, we need national police reform. And yes, we need voting reform, but we need our nation to finally make the investments to bring about change and progress. And we know it's possible because those investments have been made time and time again, whether it was our Japanese American brothers and sisters who were taken into internment camps and the resources that they received, whether it was the GI Bill, which really helped individuals move, right, from poverty to the middle class. That is a conversation that we not only need to have, but action, I think, must be taken within this Congress. And I'm hoping that the Biden administration and the democratically controlled Congress will finally put these things into action.
Yes, absolutely. Beto, how about you?
It was so well said by Reverend Waters. And let me add this to it. Leah, you mentioned, it almost goes without saying, and yet we must say it, that responding to a pandemic that has claimed the lives of nearly 350,000 of our fellow Americans, and you're absolutely right, we comprise 4% of the globe's population, more than 20%, 1/5 of the planet's deaths, and yet we are the wealthiest, most powerful, most technologically and medically advanced country on earth right now. And who's bearing the brunt of this? It's very much Mexican-American families, Native American families, Black families, communities of color. Here in El Paso, my hometown, we recently were the hardest hit city in America, bar none. So many people dying so quickly in an 85% Mexican-American city that they have set up more than 10 mobile morgues. They had to call in the National Guard in a city of 1 million people because there aren't well enough to move the dead bodies right now. And it's not unique to El Paso. You look at any community along the US-Mexico border, and you will see something very similar. And so ensuring that not only do we distribute these vaccines and do it equitably, but I would prioritize those communities that have been hit hardest already to make sure that they are at the front of the line to get the help that they so desperately need. It's literally a life or death issue. Second, I do think, and I know there are opinions to the contrary, that we must have accountability for this president and those who are complicit in the coup attempt, in the insurrection and sedition. If it goes unpunished, it will have set the precedent that you can defy the Constitution and the rule of law, you can rise up and try to overturn a freely, fairly, peacefully, democratically decided election, and that there will be no consequences. And if we do that, then I guarantee you we will see more attempts, and a future one will be successful. And so I think ensuring that there's both impeachment and conviction of the president, expulsion of those senators and members of Congress who were complicit in this white supremacist insurrection at the United States Capitol, with the Confederate flag in full force, that's got to be a priority. And then one last thing, the Reverend Waters mentioned this, you mentioned this, making sure that our democracy really works for everyone. There's a bill that was proposed in the last Congress, H.R. 1. If it's reintroduced, it must be passed by the House and Senate, signed into law by President Biden. It would reinstate Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It would allow for same-day and automatic voter registration. It would guarantee that more people have access to the ballot box. And I'm confident, speaking as somebody in one of the most diverse states in the country, that when our full genius is brought to bear in these elections, you will see this country take a much better, far more just course going forward. And so I think if we could get those fundamentals right, we'd be in a much better position in the long term.
Absolutely. I mean, these are the kinds of things that need to happen. And I'm hoping that as those of you who are watching, that you're taking notes on some of these things, because we can get involved as everyday citizens. We can call our representatives, call our senators, call the White House when President Biden is in office to say, these are the kinds of things that we demand. You know, power concedes nothing without a demand, has already been said. And unless we are willing to get actively involved, to stand up, speak up and say, no, we are not going to tolerate this white supremacist rule any longer. We have to move forward in another way. Policing alone, for the past 10 years plus, every time an unarmed Black person of color is killed by a police officer, what do we hear? Oh, I felt threatened, or he didn't comply, or I had to stop the threat. And that's why within 2 seconds or 3 seconds or 1 minute, they had to shoot an unarmed Black person in the back, in the front, in the top, bottom, wherever it might be. But last week we witnessed police officers being beaten, shoved, pushed, stomped on, and hit with American flags, and the weapons were not even drawn. That ought to reshape our conversation about policing for the rest of our days. That was the most extreme case of de-escalation, if you will, that we've ever witnessed. If there was ever a time for a police officer to have a right that he or she felt threatened and needed to discharge his or her weapon, it was with what we saw last Wednesday. But instead, the weapons get charged on 12-year-olds standing with toy guns, or a naked man in Atlanta, Anthony Hill, who is having a mental break, completely naked, you know, and the list just goes on and on and on. That's when weapons get discharged on Black bodies. And so in light of what we saw with our own eyes, is to how police officers can and do use restraint when they choose to. We have to demand that that is extended to every citizen, most importantly, since we're the ones most disaffected by it, Black people in this country. So amen and yes to all of this that you all have said, the really important information that you've given. Thank you for connecting the dots historically in the ways that you have. I know that there are many people that want to ask some questions, and so we want to have an opportunity to open up the request question line. And I see Deborah on the screen now from Chalice Press, who is going to take over this portion of our time this evening. Hi, Deborah.
Hi, Leah. Thank you so much. And thanks to you all on the panel. We do have some questions, so let's get right to them. Michael, I wanted you also to introduce some special guests that are with us tonight. Because the first two questions are from them. These are special guests from the DC Department of Corrections. So Michael, why don't you just name those folks, and then I will lift up the first two questions for us.
Yes, I'm so grateful to have these wonderful men and women with us. Last February, I was in DC for the Congressional Black Caucus's National Emergency meeting. And while there, accompanied my wife to one of the correctional facilities and had an opportunity to sit and share with these men and later with the women there, bright, amazing men and women who have much to contribute to our conversation, particularly on race and racism and white supremacy. I was on one of their podcasts recently, and so grateful that they are with us today and look forward to receiving their questions.
Yeah, so the first question, how do you feel racial justice can be extended to the large number of Black people who are incarcerated in this country? How can we join the fight to be part of the solution?
Wonderful question and a necessary question. When we talk about something in the water, we have to talk about even how laws have been constructed. We have to talk about the origins, the epistemology of policing, right? That policing emerged during the days of slavery to apprehend Black bodies to bring about profits. That's why it happened. In the North, policing emerged to force the undesirables to stay in ghettos, right? And we see manifestations of that continuing today from stop and frisk policies that go forth without equity, the way laws were constructed during the quote unquote war on drugs, which is suggested that President Nixon actually put forth to stop leftist movements and the Black power struggle, right? That continue to manifest and create great harms to the realities today that when you look at the number of Black men and boys in America, and you look at how many of them are killed in police encounters, that really death by police is the 7th leading cause of death for Black men ages 25 to 29, right? All of these things, right? As we're talking right now, there are persons in our nation who are making millions of dollars a year through the sale of marijuana. And we have other persons who are still incarcerated for that quote unquote same crime, who failed to be released, right? That is a part of our history. So one of the things we've got to do is we've got to change the system. We've got to change the laws. We've got to change the nets that have been erected to ensnarl bodies, right? The system is actually working as it was designed. So many people say all the time that, the system is broken. It is not broken. It is working exactly as it was designed to work. It is apprehending exactly the persons it's designed to apprehend, and is continuing to create great harms. I want to suggest, though, that one of the ways we begin with the work is by centering the voices of those who have been most impacted. I don't know how we can bring about a better, more equitable system without having incarcerated persons and returning citizens at the table leading the way. And I also want to go on record as saying, my heart breaks every single time there is a report of a man or woman who has been locked up for 30, 40 years, only to discover that they did not commit the crime, right? And unfortunately, we know that there are a multiplicity of individuals who have that same testimony. So oftentimes the assumption is simply with the suggestion that a crime is committed, that in fact it has. When in fact, I know there are innocent persons, even at this time, who are behind bars, who have been targeted by this system that is working exactly as it was designed to work.
Thank you. Okay, as next question, over the last year, we've seen dozens of books released or given a second look that dealt with civil rights, racism, and or the Black experience. What about your book, Something in the Water, makes it stand out amongst the crowd as a must read? I like this question.
Wow. I think in some regards, it's been my proximity to the history. And I always want to call forth her name. She's joined us as a part of our dialogue today, as part of the audience. The tremendous Reverend Sharon Risher, also an author with Childless Press, whose sainted mother, Ethel Lance, was shot 8 times point blank range in Mother Emanuel AME Church. My proximity to that experience, to Sharon's work and struggle in the midst of that, my journey to that church where I was able to bear witness for myself to bullet holes in the walls and in the floors, and understanding those were the bullets that went through or missed bodies. To go from there to the Delta in Mississippi, the very place where that young 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till's body was brought up from the water, and to hear the locals say with piercing clarity that there was nothing exceptional about Emmett Till because we were always pulling bodies out of the water. To journey from there to Charlottesville, where Heather Heyer was killed, to journey from there to the Something in the Water Festival, where I was invited to speak for a festival put forth by Pharrell Williams, a crowd of 5,000 people on the beach looking over the Atlantic Ocean, only a few miles from where my ancestors were first brought upon these shores, right? All those experiences, giving witness to that really shapes not only the book, but shapes my activism as well. And so you're hearing from someone who's not simply writing from the standpoint of writing for the history books, but someone who is visiting the history and connecting with persons who are still being impacted by the harms that have been put forth by that history. I think, maybe one of my heroes, James Baldwin, provided you an opportunity to travel with him and through his lens and through his experiences. And I think that that's what separates this book. It is an invitation to journey and to lament and to be inspired, I pray, to be a part of the change that is needed.
Thank you. Next question from Karen. Just curious as to what daily practices help us all continue to be active rather than passive. As a white person, it is too easy to not live this daily as communities of color do.
I think Brian Stevenson possibly says it best when he talks about being proximate. Some people have the opportunity to check out. Others don't have that opportunity. They have the opportunity to be involved in justice work and then return home to a place of comfort. There are persons in our nation who are daily simply struggling to survive. Every day is a justice issue. When social services doesn't serve their community, it's a justice issue. When you have technological apartheid and they can't get Wi-Fi so that their kids can study in the midst of a pandemic, it's a justice issue. When you're dealing with food apartheid and you have to travel miles outside of your community to find fresh produce, it's a justice issue, right? And so by being proximate to persons who are having that experience, even if that is not your personal experience, it continues to draw you back to the work. And I think that is the call, to literally put yourself, or figuratively, I should say, put yourself in someone else's shoes, to really glean from their experience and be inspired to change, and ultimately work to the point where you don't make a differentiation between their child and your child. If it were your child that were hungry, you would do everything in your power, everything in your capacity to make sure that child was fed. When you stop making distinctions between children and you claim them all as your own, you have a tireless drive to be a part of that change. I think part of the issue we have in this nation, right, and I'll say this very quickly, is that we've talked about children in cages. It's different when you say, that's my child in the cage, right? You would be tireless in your efforts to bring that child out of the cage off of a concrete mattress with a foil blanket. I think that is our call, and that actually rises to us from the scriptures. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. That type of love for neighbor, when you are one with them, one with their experiences, you will rest at nothing to bring about their liberation.
Leah or Beto, is there anything you'd want to add on daily practices? Or should we move to the next question?
Just really quickly, I agree with all of that, and just recognizing that this kind of, especially as I hear, a lot of times white people will say to me, well, I just teach my children not to see color, and we just teach them to, see everybody the same. And I say, well, you're teaching them not to see me, and you're actually teaching them not to see yourself, because white is still a color. And we know that race is a social construct. So, but what we need to teach is that there is meaning assigned to race through this, where black and brown is deficient and white is superior. And so just this ongoing sort of not only awareness of that, but how we talk about it and move around about it in our everydayness. That is a really important thing that we need people to do.
I'd just add this, that I think so many of us, especially given what's going on in our government and in our democracy and in our country at large, whether it's COVID or the recession or these fundamental, profound issues of justice, so many can be tempted to despair and can be forgiven because I don't know that we faced a set of circumstances like these, certainly not in our lifetime. In my life, and I've heard this from others, so much of the antidote to that despair is action, and a refusal to accept what is as what will always be. And again, I got to tell you, I mean this from the bottom of my heart, listening to Reverend Waters and reading his book moves me to act, and really reminds me that none of this has to be accepted. All of it must be understood and acknowledged. And it really calls for what Isabel Wilkerson refers to as a radical empathy, and Reverend Waters describes it as proximity. And I think that's definitely called for at this moment, but we must move, we must act, we must meet this moment. And I, you know, as hard as that work is, and I can't think of anything harder to do right now, there's something deeply fulfilling about that. And it is not only the antidote to despair, I also think it is the key to the victories that we seek. This conversation definitely reminds me of it, listening to Leah, listening to Michael right now, and these really thoughtful questions that are being asked.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. I think, Michael, a few folks are wondering what is behind you there, yes, tell us what that is behind your right shoulder.
Sure. So this is an African symbol known as a Sankofa, and this is a Sankofa bird. Sankofa means go back and fetch it. The idea is that you have an image of a bird whose feet are facing forward, moving forward into the future. Oftentimes it's depicted with an egg on its back, which is also representative of the future. In this case, it's a cross, but the head is backwards, right? So the idea is of journeying forward while looking backward, that we can't know the way forward until we know the history behind us. And so that was made by a wonderful man in our city, now departed, a wonderful woman named Miss Equate, who is his widow and leads the Pan-African Connection here in Dallas, one of my favorite places. It was one of the last pieces that her late husband created with his hands. And so I'm very honored to have it and display it before you tonight. Also had someone ask about the picture behind me. It's one of my favorite pictures. And the reason it is because it reminds me of my grandfather. It's from the 1940s. Some young men dressed in their Sunday's best on an Easter Sunday. And I always think about my grandfather, and he would be a little bit older than they were at that time, but it still draws me back to his remembrance. But interestingly enough, that photo was taken by the US government. And that's another reason why I have it. The US government was doing a national tour, poverty tour, in the 40s to find out what was impacting people in poverty, but particularly people of color. And so you look at the joy and you look at the dignity of the picture, but you also understand the realities that informed these young people's experience. And so it's a way of centering me as well in terms of the arc of this work and the importance of continuing to contribute to it in each generation.
Beautiful. St. Andrew Christian Church is asking, the challenges of justice are real. The conditions of our country are embarrassing. The work is critical. Where do you see places of light and hope in this justice work?
Well, you know what, I want to commend Beto, and really that is a sign of hope. During his senatorial campaign, and some of you will recall this, as he traveled throughout the state and really left no stone unturned, there was a gentleman who addressed him concerning Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling that was taking place, and really wanted to draw Beto into a place of denouncing the action. And Beto instead stood very strongly and offered an understanding that was being rooted in his understanding of our experience and of that plight and what it would take to bring about change. That is a hopeful thing for me, that there are elected officials, that there are leaders in our country, that there are organizers and persons who are moving the needle forward, who are stretching, if you will, to truly understand the cost, what it will take to bring about change. That's a hopeful moment. Now, it is always concerning for me that so much change in our nation has happened because of bloodshed. Back in February, I was with Mrs. Rudolph, Sarah Collins Rudolph, who was the fifth little girl standing in the threshold of the lounge in 16th Street Baptist Church. She lost an eye in that bombing. You can still study the scar tissue around that eye. I was with her that day, and recognizing that we are not far removed from that history, recognizing the sacrifices that were made in their day to bring us to this point of progress. So we've got to continue to make that sacrifice. And I find it hopeful that even though there's still been great bloodshed and great life lost, there are still persons like Beto and others who are willing, I think, to answer the call and bring forth change. And ultimately, I hope, and this is my personal hope, that the movement we saw manifest in Georgia to tilt Georgia, I think, to a place that would bring about greater liberation in the state. I believe in many ways, Beto has blazed the path that we can build on. And I'm hopeful for the future of Texas, that we can do away with the tripart evils of slavery, of genocide, and colonialism that have informed our state, and really move our state to a place of peace, justice, and equality.
Any response, Leah or Beto, to that? Places you're seeing light and hope in this work?
You know, I've been seeing so many people that folks would not assume would care about issues of racial justice actually show their care through action, through engaging in marches, through engaging in sacred conversations on race, to really having the kind of hard dialogue within congregations and communities, to be willing to sit at the table with family and say, no, you know, those views are wrong. That president actually lied to you. You know, is be willing to take those kinds of risks gives me hope, because you know, I keep saying it goes. So much of this is about the everydayness of our coming and going and the things that we do and the people we interface with. The majority of white people in this country voted for Donald J. Trump. That's a fact, even after these past 4 years. And so, and the ideology that goes with that, and unless we're really getting into being willing to have the hard conversations, where I'm seeing more and more people being inspired to do that, conversations that can lead to corresponding action to do many of the kinds of things that Beto and Michael have been talking about, is where I see hope.
This is my first time getting to hear Leah speak, and I got to tell you, Leah, it's pretty inspiring, and I immediately am thinking about how do I look you up and find out what you've written and what you're doing, and you know, get on board wherever you're going, because I love it, and I want to be on that train. And you know, I've listened to Michael so many times, and one of the last big events that I got to participate in as a candidate for the Democratic nomination in 2019 was this rally against hate in Dallas that Reverend Waters spoke at. And I tell you what, he just brought so many of us to the core of what we're feeling as Americans, as human beings, defining not just what the election was about in 2020, but what we are about as human beings, and hopefully as Americans in this effort to live up to the promise of our foundational documents. And you know, the fact that there are these good people doing this great work and sharing this with others. And Michael, right now through this book, I so often can become overly focused on the negative and the things that concern me or downright scare me, and the anger that I feel towards those who are bringing this country to this moment. And it's moments like these that I'm reminded of all of the really good people who are out there, who are not just leading good lives, but are bringing others onto a good path. And I think that the two people that we get to listen to tonight in Leah and Michael are a reminder of that for me. And Michael mentioned this about Georgia. Look, our democracy really since the Civil War has never been attacked in such a brazen, open way as it is being attacked right now. And this coup, and we saw manifestation of it in the slowing of the mails, the attack on the legitimacy of the elections by the president and his enablers, the march on the Capitol on Wednesday. It's not over. And we should not in any way comfort ourselves with the knowledge that Joe Biden will be sworn in on the 20th and think that it is over. This coup is happening in real time. And yet, participating in this conversation and knowing that Leah and Michael are out there, I know that we have it within us to meet this, that we possess the capacity to transcend, transform, to become who we should be. And Leah said this, at the outset. I mean, and Michael said this in his book, don't let anyone say that this is not America, that this is not who we are. This is very much who we are right now, but we have the power to be better. And Michael talked about Georgia, and lost in this attack on our democracy was this extraordinary victory for our democracy, for Reverend Raphael Warnock to become the first Black man elected to the United States Senate, first Democrat at least, in the former Confederacy since the end of Reconstruction, for John Ossoff, a Jewish man, to be elected out of Georgia, for Democrats to have functional control of the Senate at this critical moment of truth. That gives me a lot of hope. And it's not a resting hope. Again, to refer to the book, which moves me to act and does not allow me to expect progress to happen of its own accord. It's not a resting hope. It's a hope that inspires action and wants me to be a better person. So I think those are some things that I want to hold on to from this conversation, from this book, and from these last couple of weeks, because we've really got our work cut out for us. It's 2020 was tough. 2021 could conceivably be even harder in many ways, and yet I think we're the people for this moment. And I'm just so grateful to be traveling in this company, and really looking forward to it. And so, Deborah, that's where I find hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, and if you could only see all the beautiful questions that are continuing to come in that we're not going to be able to get to tonight, including a final question. Are you panelists going to take this conversation across the country? This needs to be heard broadly. So I don't know if that means like there's a part 2 coming, but there's a lot of questions here, and just people referring to the honesty of this conversation and just the chance to talk in this way. So thank you all so much, but we are going to have to wrap up. I'm going to turn it back over to Brad Lyons. We're going to send you a follow-up with a link to the recording and the book trailer that we weren't able to show you tonight. And Brad, I'll let you kind of wrap, and then I think Michael will be wrapping.
He will. Thank you. What a wonderful conversation. There's so much left to do. So much that we had to leave unsaid tonight, and we are grateful for all of you who have shared your time with us tonight. I want to thank Congressman O'Rourke, Dr. Gunning Francis, and Reverend Dr. Waters for their wisdom and their insight this evening. I also want to thank you. We had 3 people on screen, but we had dozens and dozens of people in the chat sharing their own incredible stories and wisdoms and their amens for the panelists. Thank you for joining the conversation and your enthusiasm. We also want to acknowledge the several co-sponsors that helped promote this evening's event, including the Interdenominational Theological Center, Dallas Black Clergy, Lone Star Justice Alliance, Southern Methodist University's Perkins School of Theology, Faith Commons, Abundant Life AME, and the Christian Recorder. If you don't already have your copy of Something in the Water, it is available now from chalicepress.com or wherever you buy books. If you can find a way to support your local bookstore, that's an added bonus. Support your small businesses where you can. Thank you for supporting Michael and for supporting Chalice Press with your purchase. As Deb just said, we will send an email tomorrow with that trailer that we couldn't show tonight. And a recording of this session will be posted on the Chalice Press YouTube page later this week so that you can hear Leah reading that passage again, because I know that's what we're all going to go back and look at. And then you can share this conversation with others who want or need to hear this message. Michael, Reverend Dr. Waters, will you please close this evening's event with a word of prayer?
First, thank you again for a wonderful evening. Beto, Leah, thank you for the time. Deborah, Brad, be remiss if I didn't mention that Beto wrote the foreword to this book, and I think it's an impactful foreword that you would enjoy. As a closing prayer, I want to offer a prayer for holy souls that comes from the book. Dear God, teach me to pray with my feet. The steps of the ancestors were sturdy and strong. They somehow carry them to cut down strange fruit dangling in the breeze, up and down Montgomery's hills, to mass meetings, lunch counters, and courthouses, to face canines, tear gas, and water hoses. As bullets and bombs wrought martyrs, their blood still crying from the deep. Lord God, teach me to pray with my feet. For those failed while adorned with hoodie, for those who still can't breathe, for those whose hearts have been broken under the weight of fathers suffocated on the street, with hands raised, don't shoot. For water protectors, for Flint, for women, for refugees, for hijab-wearing sisters and their brothers, for the dreamers. Lord God Almighty, teach me how to pray with my feet, that I might become a drum major for justice, to march around Jericho's walls and monuments to white supremacy till they come tumbling down, that I might say, as did Mother Pollard to young Martin, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested, and that you, Lord God Almighty, may one day say to me, you have beautiful feet. Amen.
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 Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. Have a great night. Have a great rest of the week. Stay safe out there. Good night.